Having said that, I'm Martin Devenney, and I'm very happy to be here with you. You won't be seeing my face very much during this session because I'll just be sharing my screen so you can see my slides. But again, if there is any kind of issue or there's any question you might have, you can just put in the chat and I will see it there. So I want to wait for a couple of seconds to make sure that we actually have stream. You'll have to excuse me for a moment, just need to check the control panel. Fantastic, I think we're rolling. Sorry about that. So, back to business. My name is Martin Devenney. I've been around doing debating mainly from London for roughly 4 years. I've mainly debated for a Swedish institution called Linköping and for UCL. I've won some tournaments. I have broken at Euros. I've judged a fair amount. But today, I would mainly like to speak to you from the perspective of a trainer. So way before I started doing debating, I have had a lot of experience doing training, horse riding, chess, music, those kind of things. And what I want to share with you, or what I want to teach you today, is how you can train yourself or how you can help each other train. So we're not going to be talking specifically about how to debate a particular position or how to generate certain arguments, but rather to just talk about what kind of methods are there out there that can allow you to train and to develop towards a certain goal. So with that, I am, if you'll indulge me, going to share to my my slides, which should come up in a second. So, how to become a better debater, because I'm assuming that you're all really good people, so you don't need to become better people. You can just become better debaters. So the purpose of this session is to give a short, let's call it self-help guide for ambitious, struggling, or even casual debaters. All of these exercises, these ideas I will suggest, are things that you can scale to your ambition level. So if you're looking right now at going to Euros, for instance, this is an excellent time to start looking at what things you want to improve to become a better debater, how much time you want to devote, and how to do it in a way that is meaningful. So I'm going to start with a little bit of theory, just so we all understand where I'm coming from and how I want you to approach these exercises, and then I'm going to just dig right into the exercises. Before I do that, however, I just want to acknowledge that there is also another very important work out there by Joe Mays, and you can find this at the Scottish EUDC Facebook page, among other pages, which touches on very similar ideas. And it's an excellent document, and I really recommend that you look at it. Some of these are going to be quite similar, but I think the benefit of listening both to this and reading that document lies in the fact that we have never really coordinated this. This is our individual training experience from our individual contexts, and therefore you can pick and mix and choose what inspires you, what you might find useful. So, first thing in theory, useful abilities in debating. So, I have listed 12 bullets here. They're fairly random, but they are qualities that are useful to have when you're debating. You can probably think of more of them, but something that I think is very helpful is to try to break down the kind of abilities you might have. Because you will see some debaters who might have a great understanding of the world. They can make people laugh. They know lots of things. They speak very fluently, but they don't really have the ability to empathize. So anytime they have to discuss sensitive issues or discuss something that requires the judges to understand a lived experience, they might struggle. So that speaker might be the kind of speaker who breaks regularly into finals, but will occasionally fail. And I think that kind of speaker would benefit from looking at, well, what is it that I am good at and what am I not good at? And then trying to find ways to develop those. So I think that taking some time in the first instance to just look at a breakdown of things that are good to do in debating and try to isolate them from each other provides a good first tool towards training. And this is really important, I think, because ultimately when it comes to training, if you look at any other activity, take football, for instance, you will never have people just playing football matches and then going, oh, I guess we won that game. Let's try to do that next game, and then lose a game and go, well, I guess we lost that game. Maybe we should avoid losing next time. But they break down things. You have professional football players just spending shooting penalties just to refine one small thing at a time to become complete. And ultimately, you can develop to a certain level by just doing debating. But if you want to challenge yourself and bring yourself to the next level, you need to start isolating things and improving those in separate from other things. So how then do you know what you need to improve on? So here I have a number of pieces of advice. The first one, which I think is the most important, is just to get a partner. Now, sometimes this is really easy. You might be going to Euros, for instance. Then you probably have a partner. That's probably a person you're going to spend a lot of time with. You might have your most regular speaking partner, but sometimes you don't. And sometimes you might have a Euros partner, but that's someone who's going to graduate in a year and you're going to be staying at university much longer. And it can be beneficial to still find someone else and reach an agreement with that person. They have more or less the same ambition levels as you, and they're therefore prepared to spend more or less as much time to develop. It means that you now have someone who can be your mirror and can start pointing out what aspects of a speaker you might want to improve on. Like thinking for yourself is helpful to a degree, but I hear lots of people thinking, or saying, what, I think I'm just really bad at thing X. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're actually quite wrong. Sometimes they were really bad at thing X 2 years ago, and then they've subconsciously been working on it, and they're quite good at that. And now they become worse or relatively worse at something else. And it's so important to have someone that helps you find what you need to develop with. The second thing I recommend is to partner up with a team. And this is specifically if you have a steady partner, especially if you're going to Euros. If you are a team going to Euros, find another team, maybe from your society, maybe from elsewhere, that is more or less at your level. Maybe you get more or less the same kind of speaker points, or maybe you're both novices. And decide to sort of form a partnership where you give feedback to each other and where you're happy to constantly point out each other's weaknesses. This is really valuable because within your team, sometimes you tend to get really blinded. Sometimes the kind of feedback you get from your team partner can be quite bad because they had an idea of what they wanted you to say. You didn't say exactly that thing, and now they're angry because they felt that you did wrong. And the feedback relies so much on their idea what the debate should have been. Having someone who's in a different part of the room or who just is happy to listen in sometimes to you is really valuable. So find that, because then you get more of that kind of information. Thirdly, find a trainer. And it doesn't have to be a professional trainer, though I would recommend, if you are serious about debating, go to Scottish EUDC and ask for someone in the training centre to a speech you've recorded, or to tune in one of your sessions, or to just have a chat on Facebook with you to answer some questions about in what direction you want to take your training. Someone who's got more experience, who speaks at a higher level, has been at your level, and can therefore help you with that. Fourthly, make sure you answer specific questions and feedback. And this is often a latter stage. If you've decided that you're going to work on your fluency, then prepare questions relating to fluency when you go up to a judge afterwards and feedback. They will have things they want to give you anyway, and you should always take that feedback. There's nothing wrong in saying, look, I've been working on making sure that my arguments have all the steps they need. People have told me to have more analysis. How do you feel that that went in this debate? And if they say, well, it didn't go that well, then ask, well, what can I do to improve that? So that all the feedback you get from judges relate to the things you need to improve. And if you don't know what to improve, well, then ask for that. Another good way of self-diagnosing is stating an objective before the debate. Say, for instance, in this speech, which is a 5-minute speech, I'm going to start concluding at 4 minutes 20. And if you don't do that, if you fail to do that, even though you said you were going to do that, then that's a good sense that you're not in control of your time management. So now you know that there is something where just deciding to make that priority still doesn't make it perfect. If you record yourself, for instance, when speaking, that's a very good way of checking that. You say something like 30 seconds for my intro, a minute for my first argument, a minute for my second argument. And then you can clock that and check, do I have my time management in control? And finally, probe. Like, take something that you think is difficult. Let's say you find econ motions difficult. Well, then sit down and maybe prep 3 econ motions in a row and ask yourself, are you happy with that result? Start looking for weaknesses or areas where you might not be as strong as you feel. There are endless ways of doing that, but make sure that you don't rely on what you were weak at a couple of months earlier or a year earlier, but you constantly test this ability in isolation. I'm going to see how good I am at this and see if what I can do to improve it. Finally, a couple of remarks on the training mentality. And this is, I think, quite particular to the exercises I'm going to suggest. But I also think it's just very important for any kind of professional training. So the first one seems obvious, and that is like that training takes time. But I think this is particularly a problem with debaters, because debaters tend to spend a lot of minutes here and there reading articles, checking things on BuzzFeed, but frustrating to spend a lot of time doing debating training, because most often that takes a form of doing an actual debate, and then you spend most of your time listening to other people. So you have a massive time investment and you don't really have a chance to work and develop on something. So what that often does is it gives us this sense that debating isn't something where it's worth it to just work on one particular aspect. Because even if I develop my ability to, I don't know, offer the perfect point of information, maybe the next time I waste an entire hour in a debate and no one took a point of information, and then I felt that the time investment was wasted. But over time, if you invest a lot of time in something like as simple as that, how to give the perfect point of information, or how to give the perfect introduction, as you take piece after piece and really work on each of those details, after a year or half a year, you'll suddenly realize that you're a really well-rounded debater in a way that you would never have become if you just tried working on everything at the same time. Having said that, training must also occur frequently. And this is the flip side, the other aspect of this, because you probably have degrees, you might have jobs, you have a social life. Where I come from in the UK, debaters frequently do not have social lives. But as we travel to Europe, we find that they very often actually do. So accept that training takes time and invest chunks of time when you can. Invest an hour when you can. But when you can't, make sure that you look for little things in your everyday life that you can use to improve your debating. Like, what kind of articles can you read on the bus to uni? Or if you're walking to uni, can you listen to an interesting podcast? Can you give a 7-minute speech in the shower? I think that's an excellent thing that can be done, and you're not really wasting time. So find the little areas where you can do small repetitive things so that you can really focus on the big things when you have big training sessions. Thirdly, always document your training. This is so important. Get yourself a notebook and make a habit of writing down every single trivial thing you have learned in debating. If you're an organized person, then separate it into topics, maybe related to the skills a couple of slides ago. So what did I pick? Did I see someone who was really fluent? Well, maybe I should make a note of where I saw that person. Maybe it was online. Maybe I can find more videos with that person. Maybe I heard someone, maybe I encountered a person with a very touching story, and I felt, oh, this is something that made me care, so I can use this to make other people care. I will put that in my big empathy section. Each person has their own way of organizing things, but make sure that you have a place where you collect all this. That's a more general thing. When you train, there are 3 things that are really important. First of all is establish the real life conditions. This is massively important as well. Like, very often I see people training on their own and they record a speech for me to give feedback on, and I can see how relaxed they are. And because they are relaxed, they do some things a bit better because they don't panic, but they're just not really focused. Their analysis isn't as sharp because they don't care as much. You can work on this to a certain degree. First of all, it's just about getting mentally prepared. Tell yourself this is massively important. Close your eyes for 15 seconds. Imagine you're in a breaking room at a really important tournament. Make sure that you ask other people in the room to take it really seriously. But also do things for yourself to put a bit of pressure in the situation. Set goals, for instance, for yourself. Tell yourself that you have to, for instance, have 2 different stakeholders that are impacted by every argument. And that might be a very arbitrary thing to set for yourself. Maybe that's what you want to work on in this time, to show how arguments affect different people. And if you don't do that, then give yourself some kind of consequence. My favorite thing is push-ups. I just, like when I do training, if I set a goal for myself and I don't meet that goal, I do push-ups because I don't like doing push-ups. And it's a very good way for me to start caring. But there's a second aspect of it that is more important. And that is, it's a good way for me to evaluate my goals. Because if I find that I've spent an entire training session just doing push-ups, then my goals were unreasonable. And the fact that I've done this tells me that my goals were unreasonable. So now I can change the goal to something that is more achievable. What usually happens with other people? Well, what people very often do is they set a goal that they think is reasonable. A very common goal, the much broader one in debating, is I'm going to average 78 speaker points. Because it might be a person who's averaging 76, and they feel that's not a very big change. But maybe it takes a year to come over just that threshold. And in that time, because you set up that goal and you're not reaching that goal, you start questioning yourself. You start nearly like being disappointed with yourself because you said that you were going to do this thing and you're failing. But actually, you failed in setting up a goal that was reasonable. So the solution is to have something that helps you monitor if you're reaching your goals so that you can achieve goals that you can reach maybe within 2 or 3 sessions. And then you can raise it, and you can raise it again. So by having, I'm going to give €1 to a charity every time I fail my goal, or I'm going to do push-ups every time I fail my goal, you can start noticing when you're trying to leap too much. And finally, and this is my biggest bugbear, I think, never be awkward. Now, what I mean is, when you get into a training session or when you sit down with someone to do prep, very often what happens is that it becomes a bit tense. You're all friends and suddenly you're trying to shift to training mode and you don't really get there. So it gets a little bit giggly, it gets a little bit unfocused, and you tend to do the bare minimum. You might do a debate, but when you're done, you're just like, you know what, let's just go have beers. And it very often starts with one person making a little bit of a sarcastic joke, and then another person picks up. And when you start doing that, it's very difficult for someone else to go, look, guys, I want to be serious. Can we make this a meaningful training thing? Because we all care about getting better. And I would really recommend you have a chat with the people you're going to work with. Look back to what I said, like the partners you found or the people you want to train with, and just say, look, when we are doing this, we're going to be serious. Then we can have fun afterwards, but sort of we're going to ban any kind of bantery things for the time we're doing that, because you will get into that habit really fast, and then it will be really natural. But you have to make that kind of commitment. So that on training mentality. Let's look at the first thing, I think, like the first way of becoming a better debater: recording yourself. So this is something that I found incredibly valuable, but I've also been doing with a lot of people I've been training. As I was preparing for Euros in 2015, I spent a couple of months just giving speeches and looking at myself on the video. It was quite frustrating, but it was incredibly useful because I got a chance to see how I how I appeared, sorry, as a speaker, and I could start changing specific details of this. So the benefits of this is that you can do this when you're on your own, you're your own partner. It definitely allows you to identify things like your fluency, your body language, things you do that you weren't aware of. But it also allows you to take small things and say, look, I'm going to work on my intros. I tend to just lose track. I waste an entire minute just saying random things because I'm getting started. And I want to make sure that the first minute of my speech says exactly what I needed to say. So just do that over and over and over again. And I can isolate that. Or I might give a 7-minute speech, but then I'm not happy with my second argument. So just re-give that argument 3 or 4 times, recording it. And then when I'm happy with how it comes across, I can just give the entire speech again. This is a benefit that we never have in debating. The speeches always happen in real time. So even if I felt that maybe something went wrong around the 2 to 4 minute mark, it's very difficult to know how to work on that and make sure it doesn't happen again. This allows you that. It also allows you to keep track of how well you're doing as a debater. You can look at a video from half a year ago and a video now and start looking at, well, I've been working towards these goals. How have I achieved them? Can I move on to a new goal? So there are a lot of ways in which this can be done. The first one that I really like is what I like to call restrict, record, evaluate. What you do here is you set yourself a restriction. For instance, in this speech, I will move on from argument to argument at specific times, and I need to adapt my speech, my argument to that time. So I might say at the 1 minute mark, 3 minute mark, 5 minute mark, and 6 minute mark, specific things should happen. Then I give a speech doing that. This is incredibly valuable because now you're making your speech more difficult than it would in a debate. That means that you have to think not only about giving your arguments, but tailoring them to an arbitrary rule. That means that now you learn to control your speech, control what happens within it, and you can start thinking of other things. You can go, okay, now I know how to exactly restrict an argument to 2 minutes. So now I know that if I want to give 3 arguments, I can fit them. And I know exactly what to put in and what to take out to be able to fit them. But it also helps you relax as a speaker. Like when you put a lot of restrictions on you, and some can be quite silly. Some can be like, give a speech standing on your head, or give a speech in a funny accent or something, just to make you add an extra element so that when you remove that, you can relax more and you can focus on what you need to focus on, which is often your arguments and often like making sure that your structure, your fluency, that all the things you want to get out there actually come out. Second one, which I touched on a bit earlier, is isolate, record, evaluate. Here you take a particular thing. Maybe it's when you did the previous method, you realized that the thing you really struggled with was getting your conclusion started on time. So the conclusion didn't sound panicked. Very often I hear speakers start their third argument at the 6 minute mark. They give that argument for 50 seconds and then they speed up really much. I go, and now to conclude, I said this thing, and as a judge, you hear nothing. Because it's supposed to be a conclusion, but it doesn't do the thing that you wanted to do, which is to somehow give the sense that these are arguments that independently have won the entire debate. So maybe it's really valuable to work on making that transition. So maybe I just give my third argument and the conclusion within a minute and a half, and I do it over and over again, record it, evaluate, and see, okay, am I there yet? We're not quite there. Do it over and over again until that piece is perfect or as good as you want it to be. Then you just have the very simple one, which I think again, very, very valuable, which is just record, repeat, record. This is often something you can do if you just want to make sure that there are, for instance, a speech for a very common debate that you can give, or you can give a speech in a particular position. Just give the entire speech, listen to it, give it again, listen to it, and listen to it over and over again as are trying to find where can you cut things, where can you change things, and what you keep constant. And by that repetition, you become more in control of your speech. And then finally, though this is going to relate a lot to the next slide, record yourself and then listen to a top debater giving the same speech. This is often quite easy to do for prime minister, but you can actually do it for anything. So like there are lots of really good debates out there that have been recorded from world championships, from Cambridge finals, from Oxford finals. Find one of those, take the motion, prepare it for 15 minutes, and then give the prime minister speech. And then listen to yourself, and then listen to the best debater in the world give the same speech, and then start comparing. What could you have done to find the things that they did earlier? What is it? Are they more efficient? Are they more, do they have better arguments? Again, it's a way for you to analyze and reflect on your own ability. One side note before I move on here, and I think this is quite important to just put out there. A lot of people tend to give speeches and then they, after a while, stop doing it, because and I like give speeches and record them and they stop doing it because they just don't like seeing themselves on video. They feel that their recorded self is just much worse than they usually are. I mean, part of this is just psychology. We generally don't see ourselves or listen to our voices very much. But it's also really important because we are often in massive denial about how we come across. I often think that I don't have much of an accent. Then I hear myself and I realize I sound as if I come right off the boat from Sweden, especially when I'm under pressure. And then I realize that. And it's not an important thing, but it tells me something about myself. I might think that don't move my hand very much when I speak. Then I see myself in a recorded video and my hands are moving all the time. Some speakers are completely unaware that they spend the entire speech moving back and forward. So they put one leg before the other and then shift their weight back and forward between those legs. That's quite distracting for the judges, but you don't notice it as a speaker. I will guarantee, take a look at it when at yourself once, and you will definitely notice that. And it's incredibly empowering. It's a really good feeling to have noticed that, and then to work on it, and then be confident that that's something that you just don't do anymore. So I really strongly recommend it, even if it might be a bit frustrating in the beginning. So, second thing, pre-recorded speeches. So there's a little bit of overlap with this on the previous thing I said, but it's still, I think, the second really valuable area of self-training that I really would like to recommend. So this is generally about finding really recommended speeches from, or good speeches that have been recorded, and working with them as training material. They become your benchmark, and they help you monitor where you're going. You can borrow things from them. This is something that we do a lot, for instance, in jazz music. We just listen to really good jazz musicians, hear something really cool they do, and then try to isolate that and incorporate that into what we do. And when we then play it, it will be different. We're not becoming them, but we're taking small part of what they do really well, and we build them into the things that we do. It's also something that tends to just help you gain a lot of confidence, because after a while, you realize that the things that these really good speakers do are things you can learn for yourself. There's not that much of a difference between you and them, and you realize that, here's something that is really achievable. And when you then go up against them, you know how they do it. So it's a very good way of dispelling a lot of the myth about the top level. But it also helps you to just gain inspiration from people from different circuits, different countries, different backgrounds. People have been trained in debating since they were 13. Everyone doesn't have that in their own debating society. So it's really valuable to access it in this way. But this requires method. A lot of the people just listen and hope that somehow by just being there and listening, they will acquire those skills. And even if you listen and think a bit, hearing how to do something is not the same thing as actually learning to do it. It's the same thing as when a judge gives you feedback and says, you know, this was a mistake, just don't do it next time. This always baffles me with debating. If a football player took a free kick and missed the goal, and the trainer said, you know what, next time, probably hit the goal. That's not very valuable information, and that's very often the way we give feedback. We very rarely get feedback as in, here is how you need to avoid this mistake, but rather, here were your mistakes, avoid them. And then you're in a completely different context. You're taking a completely different free kick, and the only thing you remember was, don't make a mistake about like that related to the previous free kick. So similarly, just looking at what one speaker does in one debate and going, you know what, I'm going to do that, unless you've mastered that skill and worked with it and made it part of your own, it will be very difficult to apply it to a completely different debate. So you need to break it down just like a football coach would, and like start looking at what is the player's approach, posture, giving them certain exercises, what are the things that we can straighten up to make sure that you do this better. So the first one that I really like doing, and this is a really good one for novices, is just what I call predict evaluate. You know the motion, you know the speaker, just jot down a couple of notes, what you think is going to come out from the speaker, what kind of argument you think will happen, and evaluate. Are you on top of this? This is sort of the big, broad sense of, do I know more or less where a top level debate would be? This can also be done in different ways. Like you could, for instance, if you've had a particular structure in your speech and you go, well, I usually have 3 arguments and I usually give so and so many seconds for each of them. Well, that could be your prediction. And then you listen to a couple of speeches and you check, is my sense of how a debate works accurate? Or at least accurate in relation to one good speaker. And then you can do it with different speakers. Similar to that is to do what I've like one of the most staple exercises, which is prep and evaluate. So you prepare an entire case for the position you're looking at. And now you have full arguments and so on, right? And you start looking at what are the arguments they give. If it's the same argument, does it contain the same parts? Do they use the same kind of examples? Do I have things in my justification that they just skip over? Maybe I don't have to say why having money is a good thing. Maybe that's something I can just assert, and then I can get more time to prove other things. So compare in detail how you would have prepared an entire speech on the speech that comes out. And then we get to my favorite parts, which is the isolation exercises. First one is just isolate and evaluate. Take the first minute of a speech and listen to it over and over and over again and break it down. Write it down by all means. That's something I've done with several speeches. Just go, when this person speaks, what do they say? What sentences do they use? What words do they use? What expressions do they use? What's their language like? What choices do they make? Do they give extraneous rebuttal at certain points? How do they introduce their material? How do they? I don't know. Like there are a million questions here, but just ask yourself the small parts. What point of information did people choose to give? Or for instance, when people give the breakdown, here's my speech is going to be this and this and this. How does that sound? Does it contain something else? Maybe some speakers say, these are going to be my arguments. It's going to be argument 1, which proves this. It's going to be argument 2, which proves this. Argument 3, which proves this. And already the judge is given an understanding of how the arguments are going to fit into the debate. Now, these are often done differently, but by taking really small pieces and working on it, you can make an assessment. Do I want to add this to my toolbox? Is this something I would like to be able to do? Is this something I haven't thought of? And when you've done that, you imitate. And I love this exercise. There are two levels to this. The first one is just try to imitate this roughly. Now we know how they do it. Can I do this? Let's say I've been looking at intros. Well, I'm going to give 10 intros following the rule that I feel the speaker follows. And when I'm happy with it and I record it and I think this is good, well, then I've learned a new way of giving intros. There might be a debate later on where that is really valuable, and I might take a higher position than I would have otherwise because of that one change. The second thing is a really tough exercise and something I would recommend for the people who are really serious about working on their control of their speeches, is to imitate a big chunk of a speech and actually imitate the speaker. So try to use the same words, maybe even the same rhythm, the same intonation. This is a really cool exercise for a couple of reasons. First of all, it just makes you realize how unique and individual people's way of expressing themselves are. So generally speaking, when we do debating, we have an idea, and then we use whatever way we would otherwise speak to communicate that idea. That's very personal. It's nearly like a fingerprint, the way we express something, the way we phrase things. Now, forcing yourself to do it in a way that someone else does it is incredibly powerful. But secondly, that makes you listen really properly. Because very often when we listen to a speech, we hear a number of sentences, but we are already processing the information. So what we register are the ideas. We don't really remember how they were said. And very often that's something that less experienced debaters struggle with. They feel that what they say in a minute and a half can be said by experienced debaters in maybe 20 or 30 seconds. And very often it's just about what words they use. How do their sentences work? And forcing yourself to use their sentences can give you a really powerful sense of other ways to do this. So now you've broadened your linguistic and your analytical toolbox so that you now have more ways of expressing things that you can use in your future debates. It's a tough exercise, and it takes a bit of time, but it's quite fun. And it just allows you to feel that there are more ways of doing things and you can control and choose them, which means you're more control of your speech. And then finally, just judging and justifying is just really, really valuable as well. Just taking a look, watching a pre-recorded debate and reaching a judgment call and just coming up with a justification for it, and then comparing that to how that debate actually turned out. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. But before I do that, just to conclude the pre-recorded speeches thing, make sure that you always have a goal. So whenever you spend time doing this, tell yourself, well, I'm going to look for a new thing to add, or I found a new thing to add last time I looked at this speech. I'm going to work on I'm going to learn how to do X. I'm going to learn how to imitate X, so that because otherwise you are very likely to just sink into passive viewing, and it's very difficult to internalize something and actually develop while you're viewing passively, rather than if you're going, this is something I'm going to do speech, this is what I want to learn. And by all means, do push-ups if you don't. So, judging. Next aspect of self-training that I really recommend. Judge lots. Why is that? Because you start understanding how the debate actually works. The debate isn't really about talking across a table. The debate is about talking to a judge. That's where the debate goes on. You'll never fully understand how the arguments relate to each other unless you do a lot of judging. It also helps you understand what judges don't pick up on. So you might feel quite often, oh, there's a speaker here that's trying to make this point, but it never really comes across. Well, ask yourself, would you make the same kind of point? Would you have been able to make it come across? Maybe there are things you thought that judges would pick up on, but they didn't. One of the most common complaints I always hear is, that judge just can't have listened. We had this argument, and then the judge said, you should have had that argument. And we were like, we already did have that argument. And it feels that way very often. But often it is the other way around. The judge might have been reminded of that argument because you said something very similar, but you did not communicate in a way. And it's very often you that need to go back and develop on how to make that, how to present that argument in a way that the judge can understand and recognize. Very often teams just go and give angry feedback instead of doing that. It also helps you assess how strong arguments are. When you hear different arguments, it's quite clear to you immediately what you're persuaded by and what you're not persuaded by. And also, it helps you identify the team's win conditions. When you're a judge, you will very often feel that something's click. A team will just say this one argument, and it is the thing that makes sense out of everything else. And you realize, wow, that's a point where they made it. That's a point where they beat this other team. I wonder what it was that made that so powerful. What questions could I ask myself to create that kind of argument myself? But if you never judge, it's very difficult to know which of those arguments it actually is. So how do we do this? First, we'll just volunteer to judge. Judge lots. Like, judging is really valuable. Go judge at tournaments. That's a good way of making your society really appreciated if you provide judges for tournaments. Talk to other panelists afterwards. Like, that's something that very few people do. Maybe you had a disagreement. Well, chat to them. Hear how they saw the debate. What did they pick up? That information is really valuable to becoming a better judge, but also to a speaker. Now you've seen a debate, but you've also heard how other people saw a debate, and now you can start thinking, well, if I was in that debate, how would I make myself understood to both of these? Then I would say try to judge your own debates. Like, if you have, like, every single time you're in a debate and you're speaking, write down as you leave the room what you think the objective call was, and then compare it to the actual call. I can't stress how important that is, because you have to make decisions in the debate as to how to divide your time, what team to rebut the most, what you want to emphasize to the judges. Do you want to emphasize how new you are in closing government? Do you want to emphasize how you beat in closing opposition because you think they're the most important team, because you might think that they're already ahead of open opposition? If you don't know which team is ahead, you will not be able to make those decisions, which means that you're likely to lose out to a team that was actually winning. So make a habit of always doing that, and do that by always committing to writing a call and then comparing. Was I right? Was I wrong? What did I miss? And as I said, judge recorded debates. When you've judged, then I would really recommend to always keep your judging notes for a day or so and work on them. That's something that you can do just after you come back from a tournament that you've judged, or if you've judged in a training session. And keep those notes and look at a team that didn't win and go, so what was missing here? What did I feel as a judge was not there? And then try to give the same speech as they gave, but add the thing that you felt would have convinced you. Then listen to yourself and ask yourself, well, now that you've added this thing, are you still winning? Well, maybe you removed something else that was really valuable at the time, but you didn't think of it because you were focused on what was missing. Well, then you go back again and try to include that as well as the thing you added. And then you keep reworking this speech that failed to persuade you to something that would have won that debate. And it helps you get a sense of, well, what things are valuable, what things are less valuable. Because now you've been in the position of a judge, and now you're making a speech for yourself that you would have been convinced by when you were actually judging. So you're getting both perspectives at the same time. Again, I'd like to remind you at this point, even though I will be seeing any questions a little bit later, please feel free to ask any question in the live chat. I'm assuming that there's someone there that can write them, and I will get back to them as I see them. So now I'm going to talk about how to work on your actual arguments, how to develop your ability to give arguments. And the first one is about how to develop arguments and make them deeper. I like to call this storytelling. This is literally the ability to tell stories. This is so important because we often bring arguments and debates, but both sides will have arguments. As the great J.K. Rowling said, the problem is that the other side has magic too, when a character is asked why they can't just use magic to sort things. It's very easy to go into debates and feel, well, we have arguments, these arguments are going to win. Both sides will have arguments, and very often it's about who can make the judges feel stronger about your arguments, make them care more. So it requires you to be empathetic. It requires you to take an argument and make that argument really persuasive. Now, that happens in two ways, either by making the judges care about your people, or making them feel that the people you're talking about are very real. It is very likely that these people exist and they're really affected by it. So this might be about, I mean, we've all, I think, done this in debates. You bring up your grandfather in a debate about how old people are treated. You bring up your friend who recently came out to talk about whatever they experienced when they went through that process. But our own experience is quite limited. So I would strongly recommend 3 things. First of all, read stories, not just like novels and literature, like stories that people write in blogs or articles that account for something that happened. Make sure there is, like, when you read something, find the story within it and relate to them as stories, so that it's not just a matter of, here's a fact, so and so many refugees came in over the Mediterranean. But try to find the story about a particular group of refugees who came over and what happened to them and what was their situation. That allows you to talk about this and go, well, look, here is an example of a group that came over the Mediterranean, and they have these characteristics, and they came for this reason. They don't have a choice, and that's why we have to care so much about them. But you need to own that story first to be able to be that storyteller. The second thing is just write stories. That's a great exercise, especially if there's something you like that you enjoy anyway. Start writing short stories, maybe about emotions, like not the story called "This House Would Ban Alcohol" and then a story about banning alcohol, but maybe you were in a debate and you would have wanted to explain why it's so important to help a particular group that struggles with their alcohol consumption. But you didn't really have an example of it. Well, maybe you can sit down and create that and think of, well, in what way would I want to express this that I know to be true? How do I form this story? How do I develop my ability to tell a story in a way that people care about? And then finally, one of the most important case file preparations I can think of is to just talk to people. But when you talk to people, remember what they say for your debate. So write it down in where you document your training, but talk to them. Ask about their stories. Everyone has some life experience that can relate to a debate. Now, this might or might not be a good thing to do anyway as a human being, but do it a bit more if you're just preparing for debating tournaments. And when you do that, start breaking it down into things that can be explained logically. Things like, this person, what kind of groups does this person belong to? And are the things that I'm talking to this person about something that happened to this person because they belong to this group? This group might be rich people. It might be the ethnic majority of the country. It might be a Caucasian person. It might be a tall person. And we all belong to groups of people that have a particular characteristic in common with us. But when you talk to someone and you realize that what they're talking about is because of that characteristic, then you can look at that story and find ways to present it. And if it is based on a real story, it will come across as more real to judges. Look for the obstacles. That's something I always ask myself. Most time when I talk to people, it's about things that are tough in their lives, or things that they would want to do, or things they're trying to do, but they haven't yet done. Always ask them, or ask yourself, well, what is the thing that stands in the way? And write that down and start building, well, for this group, there is this obstacle. For children, for instance, a big obstacle to them is that they can't communicate when they feel unhappy at a young age. So a lot of children with depression go undetected. I knew that because I spoke to someone who only found out they were depressed when they were teenagers, but in retrospect, they are telling me how they realized it when they were younger. Oh wow, that's really interesting. I can build something out of this. This seems to be something that is a real thing that I can understand and I can then communicate to a judge. So use all these encounters as a way to build a big portfolio of stories to tell for all situations, for all groups, that can make judges feel, you know what? Yep, this is the most important group in this debate. They seem to be really affected, and I understand in what way. It's not just statistics. I can see these people. I can feel them. I might even be able to smell them. Second thing about matter is how to understand the world. Now, this is about the opposite of this, right? So, like, it's really important to be able to tell the story of people, but you sometimes also need to understand the bigger dynamics to not miss the debate, right? Like, you don't want to have a debate about the Arab League and then, as a famous debater famously did, make arguments about why Iran would benefit from being part of an increasingly close Arab League, not recognizing that Iran is not an Arabic country. It also just helps you, the more you understand the world, not just know things about the world, start understanding how strong your arguments are, but also how your judges' intuitions work, and you just learn more. So I want to make a distinction here between understanding the world and just learning things about the world. So what debaters tend to do, and what we all do, is just learn facts. But we spend very little time understanding them and understanding how they work. The first thing I would recommend is to, whenever you read an article or whenever someone has an opinion, find the middle ground. So where do people more or less agree on this issue? Maybe someone shares an article with you on Facebook or it's in BuzzFeed, and it's usually something that is, people usually share things they have very strong opinions about. Debaters in particular, they will write, oh, look at this article that explains the point I've always tried to make. I mean, that's great, but it doesn't show you how to make that more persuasive than what would have been said. It doesn't tell you how a person who doesn't already buy that opinion or share that opinion would relate to that article. So try to look, for instance, in the comment sections under those kind of clips and try to see, what do people generally say? Where do they just go off in massive troll rages, and where do people seem to not disagree? What is a middle ground from which I would want to drag people to share my position? And very similar to that is to find the other side. Again, a lot of the things we get shared with us are part of like a massive echo chamber. We like our friends, and we probably choose friends that we don't have massive fights with. So we might share quite similar ideas. But whenever you see a big article, just look at, what is the other side? Like, what is someone who really doesn't believe the thing that is obvious to me? How do they express that view? Google a bit. They exist, right? They exist on their own pages, in their own fora. If it's a right-wing extremist, for instance, they exist somewhere. Find that and understand what is that goes on the other side of each argument, even if you don't share it. Maybe right-wing extremists aren't the most valuable people to understand on the other side because you're rarely asked to defend that. But maybe you are very liberal and you are only seeing things on the liberal side, how to make liberal arguments. We'll find out how to make the conservative argument against that. So you are, for everything you're interested in, you've also looked at the way the other side works. It means that you can enter debates knowing not only what arguments exist, but what are going to be the things that the other side assume, and how do you engage with that and bring it over to your side. Finally, always identify obstacles. Whenever you read an article, it's nearly always about a problem. If there's an article about what happens in the Gaza Strip, because there are problems there. Whenever you read these articles, it's very easy to just look at what has happened. Oh my God, this is a really bad thing. I should remember that it's a good example of a bad thing that has happened. We don't always stop and ask ourselves, what is it that prevents us from just making this good? And when we that is usually when we're able to make a full argument. When we realize what the obstacle to solving something is, then we can start looking at what kind of argument, what kind of things could solve those obstacles. So if we have a policy that we can show removes an obstacle to someone's happiness, then that is an policy that we can defend as being good. But if we just go, here's a policy, it will make people happy, then we have never considered what other obstacles might be in the way of making them happy. So maybe we have a great policy, but we haven't considered maybe we're giving lots of money to the poor, for instance, but we're not considering the fact that for very many people, like many poor people, expenses are just higher because of this, like the structural issues they face. So it doesn't help them. We haven't dealt with the thing that keeps making them poor. We have just given them money. So always look for the obstacle. And as you do this, I think it's also really important to always think about what you think the general sense is of the debating community. We're all on Facebook. And it's very often important to just look at, well, if you always get things on one side of one debate, then be aware that you're probably going to have a judge who has those kind of intuitions. And you can use that to direct your argument a bit in that way. So for instance, the debating community is quite famous for being very liberal. And there are some debaters who really just look for the most liberal pitch. Now, that's never fully going to work because good judges can recognize the value of conservative arguments. But it's still a good way of understanding what a lot of people in your room probably believe the debate is going to be about. I think John Oliver is a great example of that. That's something you can watch on, or like the Last Week Tonight. It's someone who definitely presents arguments that are very much in line with what liberals would think. If you see them, then you have a good sense of what kind of intuitions your judge might have, and then what you can do to start moving your judge away from those intuitions towards the side that you have. But those are the kind of questions that you always need to ask yourself when you look at, when you read articles, when you study whatever degree you do, not just what are the good things, what are the bad things, what are going on, but always how does this relate to a debate? What is on the other side of this, and what are the obstacles that stand in the way of this problem being resolved? Look for them, and if they're not in that article, then do some Googling. It is definitely worth the time. The, I think, final thing that I want to share with you is how to do better engagement. The engagement is a thing where you deal with the other side, you do rebuttal, or you have parts in your argument that defeat the other side, or you might have reasons for why your arguments are more important than the other side. This is, again, among the skills I outlined in the beginning, something that the debater needs to do to improve. And there are lots of ways of developing this. The benefit of working with your engagement is that you just have an ability to shut down your opponent's arguments like at an earlier stage, whether or not your arguments are better. But it also, like, when you work on your engagement, it helps you predict the kind of rebuttal that comes against you. It also allows you to choose the kind of arguments that are more immune, because you know what kind of objections will come against you. It also helps you set up a debate in what we call framing, where you tell the judges already what they should care and not care about, because you already have a sense of where the debate will play out, what will be the main ideas where you have the biggest disagreements. So I would like to recommend 4 of my favorite methods for this. First of all, whenever you have a motion or you're thinking about an idea, if you're preparing this for your case file or you're just writing down some ideas, debate it out. Like, this might just be you and your partner, for instance. It might be you and your partner and the team that you partnered up with. So have a debate just to try it out and see, well, how do these things interact? What did come out? Maybe you'll surprise each other by the things that you actually say in the debate, because you're inspired by the way the arguments come out, or you're able to spot weaknesses, but you didn't think about that when you were just talking about it. But secondly, debate it out and then switch sides. This is particularly useful in a top half debate. Just have the debate once and then change sides immediately. It's very easy if you've been at debate once and you feel the side you were on was a little bit favored because you've been thinking about those arguments. Having done both immediately after each other really gives you a good sense of how to win it from either side, but also what to be the most wary of from the other side. So you can start predicting things much more, and you might be several steps ahead of your opponent when those debates occur. Secondly, and this is also one of my favorite things, this is something that can be done really, really well when you just debate. You might not even have a judge. It might just be like 4 people or even 2 people. You might just do 2 speeches. It might be you and your partner, and you just take one side each and give 2 speeches each. Afterwards, your job is to justify why the other side won. So I very often see people do top half debates, which is when you only have 2 teams. And after that, because there was no continuation of the debate, both sides are just really convinced that they won. They got their arguments out there, and they didn't really feel the other side dealt with it very well. If you immediately bend your mind to look at why the other side might have won, you're going to identify the things that the judge might have credited against you. And if you do that several times, you're going to be better doing that while the debate goes on, so you can start attacking the things that are beating you that you might not have identified again. But with all the other exercises, this is something you need to do over and over and over again. It's not just about learning it, but about doing it so often that it becomes second nature. Third method I recommend, this is for mainly on your own, just write it out. Take a motion and write out on both sides, what are the main arguments? And then start looking at, well, how do they defeat each other? If you have both sides say, this is going to help the poor, well, sit down for a while and ask yourself, well, if you were to give both of them, which one of you would beat yourself? You get a sense of how strong it is. And maybe when you realize that, you also realize that, hang on, if my government argument about helping poor people beats the opposition argument about helping poor people, maybe I missed something in the opposition argument. And then you add something there, and you go deeper and deeper into the arguments, so you already prepare the things that will beat things that come from your opponents. Another way that I really recommend doing this is just switching sides when you write it. So write down a good government case. It's probably actually my favorite writing exercise. Then immediately after that, you take 10 seconds, just wipe your brain clean, and then write the opposition case. And really, really try to beat that case. Really find the weaknesses in what you just wrote. And then take a little break and go back over to the deputy prime minister and keep writing it out side for side. It is a really difficult task, because you'll find quite soon that you felt that your previous arguments were pretty perfect. So how do you defeat them? But after a while, you realize that there's always some angle you can take, and then you help push your arguments deeper and deeper, which means that you will now, if you do this repeatedly, you will have a deeper understanding of the arguments when you're prepping. You will search for these arguments or these levels of the arguments much earlier. Finally, I would really recommend occasionally just drawing a flowchart of some arguments. So especially when you have policies, write a box. This thing happens. Policy is introduced. Next thing happens. Some people will be angry. What will they do? Make sure that you have all the steps in your argument and you visualize them. One thing happens after the other. That does a couple of things. Like, first of all, it helps you separate the strong arguments from the weaker arguments, because often you will find that some of your arguments require 10 steps in your flowchart. Then you realize that, you know what, maybe this impact you're talking about is not really something that is that related to the motion. It's just, the kind of argument that people go, well, if we give more votes to the poor, then poor people will have a bigger say in policy, which means that more policies will give money to areas in poor communities, which means that a lot of the congestion that happens in those communities, because very often people might not have the ability to buy the like most energy efficient cars, so they pollute much more, which means that we're going to benefit the environment and reduce carbon emissions. There are a lot of steps of separation there, and sometimes we don't really realize that because we're so keen to find new arguments. When you draw it out logically, it's easy to identify which arguments relate much stronger to the motion and which do not. And secondly, very often it just helps you see what things are unnecessary. Maybe if you've drawn one argument and that seems really strong, a second argument that is practically the same thing, maybe you don't need that. So to help you sort out the arguments that don't really contribute new things. So when you draw those flow charts, generally speaking, try to start with the thing you want to prove, the thing that if the judge is convinced of this fact, then they will also be convinced on your side. And draw links from your policy, from your arguments to reach to that. And then you can start, once you've created that full chain, you can start looking at and see, is it a strong chain? Is it a weak chain? Where can it be attacked? Where do I need to strengthen it? And it gives you a much better sense of the components of your arguments, where people are going to engage with it and how you can defend it. And also, of course, it will help you recognize when your opponents have long, convoluted arguments and how to attack those. So these are different methods you can use, different exercises that can help you just work on skills that will allow you to engage better and more efficiently. So ultimately, what is a good debater? And as my slightly cheesy image suggests, a good debater can look in exactly any way. We all have our unique style, we all have our unique knowledge, and we all have our unique strengths, advantages, but also like weaknesses. But you can take that package of what you have and start saying, look, what I am right now is really good. It gives me most often speeches that are around 75 or 73, or usually gives me a couple of wins every tournament, or whatever it is. But if I can take something and just make that much better than I was before, if I give myself a superpower within one area, I might still be the debater I was before for my speech, but I'm giving points of information like the world champion. Then that might bring you up 1 point in your average. And then you might work on your inner structure with one of those exercises. So you give arguments that are structured like the world champions. And now you have two things that are better than everything that you had before, while you're not worse in any way than the other things. That is how you become a better and more well-rounded debater. And I would strongly recommend that you consider what for you might be the most useful thing and focus on one thing at a time. Because the risk is always that the speaker instead goes, oh, I've been doing my entire speech in way A for 3 months, but I don't think I'm winning enough. I'm going to change my entire speech. And that means they start over from the beginning, and then they start over from the beginning, and they do it over and over and over again. And the only development they get is just the development anyone gets from experience. With the right method, with the right exercises, with the right partners, you can develop much more rapidly, much more efficiently. And I would like to wish all of you the very, very best of luck doing that. Now, I will sit around in awkward silence for another 40 seconds to see if there are any questions. And if not, I'd like to wish you a really nice evening. Okay, sorry about the awkward silence. So the question is, how do you use storytelling in particular to convince a judge of your argument? So this is what I generally like to call impacting, and it is, let's say you're discussing a debate about the poor, for instance, like people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. Now, it's very easy to just go, well, the poor in general need more money, or the poor in general need more votes. And then another side says, no, actually, what the poor really need is representation in parliament. And maybe this debate comes down to whether or not they get representation in parliament, or whether they get more money. So in order for me to convince a judge that the thing I say they need is something they need more, is by creating a story that, or like describing what the situation of someone who doesn't have money might be like. What are the obstacles they face? What are their struggles? That what they need in particular is a thing that I have. So instead of talking about the big group, which consists of lots of different people and that they might have any characteristics, I now break it down to something very specific. So I explain, well, if you are a single mother, for instance, and the thing that you're concerned the most about is making sure that you can put nice clothes on your children, and you can give them good food so they have good nutrition, because that is a thing that from day to day keeps them secure, keeps them happy. That is something I can understand as a judge. And then I can go, you know what, maybe for this individual, just having a bit more money that they can use for the most important thing in their life is more important than representation, which might only help them 3 or 4 years later, where it might be too late for them. So maybe the poor as a big group might benefit from it, but maybe on the individual level, they benefit less from that than just getting more money. As a judge, I can reward that. I can credit that as being more persuasive than the other side, because since I can't introduce my own ideas about this group, I need you to tell me how they work. I need you to put a more concrete face on them. And that happens when you when you're able to tell a story, or when you're able to make it more specific, more related to something I can empathize with, more related to a real situation. I hope that answered the question, and I don't see any more questions coming in. So with that, I will over and out.